Hi, I'm Rabbi Rachel Ain from Sutton Place Synagogue, a conservative synagogue in Midtown East here in New York City. Thrilled to be part of Dialogue Across the Streams.
I'm Rabbi Jason Herman. I'm the rabbi of the Hudson Yard Synagogue and Orthodox Synagogue in West Midtown, New York City. And I'm also very delighted to be part of Dialogue Across the Streams.
And I'm Rabbi Ami Hirsch, the senior rabbi of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. And our moderator, Michael Rausch, is a member of our congregation. So thank you, Michael.
And as Rabbi Hirsch said, my name is Michael Rausch, and I am not a rabbi, but a member congregant at Stephen Wise. And I promise I will try not to show favoritism towards Rabbi Hirsch. But have been honored to be invited to moderate a conversation, or a GabFest, as you call it. And I thought we'd start today with the idea of social media and Judaism. And I was reading about the new representative from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and her Facebook post from, I think, 2018 about how the California wildfires were started in part by the Rothschilds using space lasers to clear paths for a train track. And fascinating first that she used the Rothschilds as the conspiracy theory as opposed to George Soros, who seems to be the more contemporary version of that. One of the parts of the space laser story that I found most disturbing was the idea that everyone just seemed to make jokes about it. It was laughed off on Twitter, which I'm on. You know, I hadn't even heard of the story until I saw tweets making jokes about the story. And while it is absurd and ridiculous, it obviously touches a stereotype that has been around and been very destructive to Jews for a long time. And now when it's on social media, it has the ability to reach millions and millions of people all across the world and perpetuate these stereotypes. And so I guess, you know, I'm curious what the three of you think about stories like that and social media's power to keep these very, very destructive stereotypes alive, and what we can do to counter them.
Well, let me say two things. Really, there are two aspects to this that I hope we can get to in the course of this conversation. The first is social media and technology and science and how that impacts on modern life. And the second is the issue of anti-Semitism. So let me just start with anti-Semitism. I hope we can circle back later. It's a virus that is present. It's built into the nature of social life. There are periods in history when it's more suppressed, but there's no vaccine for this virus of anti-Semitism. We can try and educate, and that is part of the response to anti-Semitism. Another part of the response is to react aggressively. Michael, as you suggest, if you suggest that we don't act aggressively enough, that's wrong, that's bad. But fundamentally, we have to embrace the concept, which is not always easy in America, that there's nothing special about our historical era as opposed to every other historical era when it comes to anti-Semitism. We must maintain vigilance. There are periods where it erupts more and periods where it erupts less. It is always present. It always comes back in force when things are worse in the country, when there's more polarization, when there's more economic deprivation, when there's more inequality, when there's generally more discontent and suffering. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And so that behooves us to respond, to take it seriously, as you pointed out, and to respond as aggressively as we can with clarity. What constitutes anti-Semitism and what is criticism that might even be wrong, but is legitimate.
I agree. I just want to add to that, that what feels new to me is that so much of this seems to be coming from the left. And growing up in New York, as I did, maybe I was unaware of active anti-Semitism on the left. It felt much more like it was coming from the right in America. And so the combination of that, along with social media, makes it feel like it's more dangerous because it feels like it can be on both sides of us than I imagine in the past in this country.
Well, look, anti-Semitism has always come from both the right and the left. It has taken some different forms from time to time, but the left wing accused Jews of all kinds of nefarious things, and the right wing has always accused Jews of all kinds of nefarious things. What tends to be the case now in modern society is that the anti-Semitism of the left tends to focus on the particularism of the Jewish people, the peoplehood element of the Jewish people. That's what offends the left. And what the left wants is for the Jews to assimilate into society so that in effect they diminish the collective component of Judaism. And that's why they're so opposed to Israel and to the Zionist enterprise. It's because what particularly bothers the left is that these darn Jews refuse to shed their particular nature, their collective nature. Why can't they be more like every other religion in Western society that is westernized, that focuses on the individual more than the collectivity?
But I think this issue specifically about how do we respond to anti-Semitism is a fascinating one. I mean, the famous line in Seinfeld, "I became Jewish for the jokes," that, someone who only when they're Jewish can they then take on the cynicism of speaking ill about themselves. But this is actually a real question today. What does it mean for individual communities to reappropriate negative stereotypes about them and then use language in their own terms? And we know that's happening in so many ways. For me, I don't make jokes about anti-Semitism. I hated The Producers. I can appreciate it as a show. I don't appreciate humor about the Holocaust or Hitler in particular. Jojo Rabbit was a movie that I didn't find funny. But there are people, smart people I love, my husband, who loves those kind of shows. He finds them smart and important and a way to have conversation. Marjorie Taylor Greene's comments are somewhere so out there that they were so ridiculous that we couldn't even believe they were being given air. The question is, when we give anything oxygen, does it breathe? And then do people find any truth? And then if people are taking snippets, well, if the Jews are saying it, then it's okay. I do think then there becomes the virtue signaling of being so serious and taking ourselves so seriously that we can't make jokes, and that's a problem too. We then criticize the people who make jokes and we become enemies of our own selves, which is something I struggle with.
So I want to jump in. Rabbi Hirsch, I think, rightly identified there was two pieces to the question. There's the anti-Semitism piece and the social media piece, and I think on the one hand they intersect, but we should look at each separately. And you, Michael, actually referenced the anti-Semitism of the left versus the right. I want to back up a little in history in terms of different types of anti-Semitism. There's a book from the 16th century written by the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Judah Loew in Prague, which was called Netzach Yisrael, which is not often a studied book, but he's explaining the notion of exile and redemption in Jewish history. And in the book, he actually defines exile as something that is out of place. And he says, over the course of Jewish history, there's three things that have really been out of place, which I think we might actually categorize as forms of anti-Semitism. The first, he calls in Hebrew Galut HaNefesh, which is the exile of the soul. And there he defines it as actually a loss of sovereignty, where you don't actually have authority of your own affairs. We might call that in modern language self-determination. Here you could actually link the entire conversation about Israel to a lack of sovereignty. He actually ties it back to the Babylonian exile when Jews lost sovereignty, over the land of Israel. The second he calls Galut Haguf, which is the exile of body, which is when people actually want to physically annihilate Jews for one reason or another, and it usually always involves some type of conspiracy. He ties that back, the prime example being Haman in the Purim story, who says to King Ahasuerus, there is a strange people scattered throughout the land that don't follow the king's edicts, and therefore they need to be destroyed. And you have throughout history, people wanted to physically destroy the Jewish people. The third he calls Galut HaSeichel, which is the exile of the mind. And he says there it's not about wanting to kill Jews, it's just we want Jews to adopt to our way of thinking. And if Jews adopt our ideas, then they're okay. He originally puts that with the Hanukkah story of Antiochus. If Jews are going to be good Hellenists and Greeks, then that's okay. But because it rejects Jewish independent thought and Jewish mind, there's an exile of the mind that happens there. We then later see that in the ideas of Christian supersessionism. As long as Jews accept Jesus, then we're okay. We don't need to kill them. They just need to accept our ideology. And you can even put that back to notions on the left today. If Jews accept our universal ideals and reject their notions of peoplehood, they're okay. And then he says there's also sometimes what he calls a Galut HaKol, where all three sort of get combined. And I think it's useful just to help think about those. The first letter of these things, Nefesh for the soul, Guf for the body, Seichel for the mind, and Hei HaKol is Nun Gimel Hei Shin, which are the four letters that we actually have on the dreidel. So actually already this ritual that we have on Hanukkah every year, spinning it just sort of reminds us of the different ways in which anti-Semitism can come about. And that's a framing that sort of already predates our left and right. But even when it appears on left and right, it can actually manifest itself in each of those ways. The anti-Semitism on the right today is very much a Galut Haguf. They want to destroy the Jewish body. We want to kill Jews because of some conspiracy. We'll talk about what those conspiracies might be. The anti-Semitism on the left is a Galut HaSeichel. We want the Jews to adopt our ideas, even if they are not necessarily in consonance with the way Jews think of their own ideas, wherever you are on the Jewish spectrum. Now, for some, they might say that therefore, because the anti-Semitism on the right poses a much more physical threat, it's worse. I don't think the Maharal would make that distinction. The Maharal can kind of say is we have the right to our independent thought, we have the right to sovereignty, and we have the right to live. And we have to just be equally combating all of those.
Right-wing anti-Semitism never accepts assimilation. Okay, they consider the Jews a threat. And if they want to assimilate, that is evidence from the part of the anti-Semites of the right, how dangerous Jews are. So really, the solution to the Jewish problem from the right wing is to suppress Jews, to isolate Jews, to expel Jews, and as we saw in the 20th century, if none of those were to kill Jews.
Right.
The anti-Semitism of the left actually wants assimilation. That's the key point. They want the Jews to shed whatever it is about Judaism that bothers them and come and join the universal crowd. And so what triggers them, what they react to especially negatively, is the Jewish collectivity expressing itself as a collectivity, which in modern times means Israel. That's why we have to be very careful about being able to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel and when it spills over into...
I think by and large that's true, but I'm going to give you one exception. And not even an exception, it's sort of a second piece to the anti-Semitism on the left. And also for the anti-Semitism on the right, I think that's true for maybe about the last 150 years. I mean, if you were to go back 300, 400, 500 years ago, if a Jew were to convert to Christianity, which was accepting, those views, the right wing, whatever the right wing in the Middle Ages, probably would have accepted that. This notion of Jews being seen not as a religion, but as, as a race and therefore something that you could never shed is a relatively modern idea. that's come up on the right. And that's in 19th century, and let the historians give you much more information about that. I think the other piece to this is that for the right wing sees Jews as a subversive threat that's coming from underneath, trying to overturn their power structure. For the left, they see Jews as part of an oppressive power structure that's oppressing people that they see as less fortunate and as a minority. Which on the one hand, that's Zionism, because Israel is a powerful force oppressing Palestinians. But it also comes in this notion that the left, and this is the conversation in America, sees Jews as part of somebody, as a group that's been accepted into whiteness, and therefore oppresses also people of color in various ways and forms, in the same way that white people also oppress people of color. And there's an anti-Semitism element to that too. You can look at some of the riots in Crown Heights, or some of the anti-Semitic events that happened in New York City literally just a little over a year ago. It's hard to remember, it was only a year ago that you had the shooting in Jersey City and the stabbing in Muncie. But that wasn't coming, because of Zionism, and it wasn't coming from right-wing white supremacists. It was coming from people of color who saw Jews as an oppressive, force, probably as a result of their whiteness, and that's the way it manifests itself in New York City. And I think, just to come to Michael's original question, the reason I think, Michael, you see much more anti-Semitism on the left, and I think we probably do as well, is because we live in New York City, and that we're surrounded more by left-wing people. It's a left-wing locality, and therefore you tend to see what's immediately around you. I think if we were living in red state America, we would probably see much more anti-Semitism on the right, just based on the proximity of what's around us. And I think that's actually the link to social media, is because social media is about the audiences and who your audiences are. So Marjorie Taylor Greene's audience on social media is not the audience that we're typically seeing and following. So it's only when it breaks its way into our circles that we see it. The things that we see on our social media feeds is probably much more left-wing dialogue. And
I want to comment on that, but I know Rabbi Haynes been waiting patiently to chime in. So please go ahead.
Well, I think that a few thoughts. I'm not sure that I agree that what we see in New York can be categorized as more on the left. We had swastikas on the front door of our synagogue in 2017. There was no indication that was a left-wing decision, or
that's fair.
Propaganda. I just, because I think we get ourselves into trouble. We can't help but speak in generalities, but I think we just need to look at that. I was on a call several weeks ago with individuals involved with the NYPD, speaking about their concerns last summer with the Black Lives Matter protest. And the perspective of the call I was on was more of a conservative right-wing approach. But I was listening intently to hear their conversation. And one of the points they made, which was a challenge to me, and I would have challenged back had I been in person and could ask a question. They said, well, it was during that moment that a lot of Jewish organizations called local precincts out of fear of concern of their own property. And therefore, that is an indication that Jewish communities are scared of left-wing ideology. And my follow-up question would have been well, is it that they're afraid of left-wing ideology, or they're afraid of what happens when groups of people get together? And was any destruction of Jewish property did that actually come to fruition? And the answer, as far as I understand it in New York, the answer was no. And we need to be honest about that do we create self-fulfilling prophecies and say, well, it must be those on the left because people are making phone calls, that it will be those on the left? So I just want to be careful with that.
I think that's fair to accept the sort of the critique. I think I was referring more to like what we see just in our own social media sphere.
Okay.
As opposed to the actual, anti-Semitic events, and there you're right. If you actually look at the actual anti-Semitic events that happened in New York, that's certainly a fair critique. But in terms of just the social media world, the people we're exposed to, you're most likely, if you're going to be in school, are you going to hear from a teacher, a fellow student, a right-wing anti-Semitic idea, or are you going to hear something about Israel from, as a high school student hearing it from their high school teacher, perhaps?
I think the bottom line is that if we are constantly on guard with respect to anti-Semitism, we need to realize that the potential for harm is so great in the 21st century because it is so much easier nowadays through social media and other technology to be able to spread conspiracies and hatred of Jews. And that really requires us to mobilize in a way that, we didn't necessarily think about in the 20th century.
And I agree with that. And I think for me, in terms of being a social media person, which mostly just Twitter, the number of times that there were comments from the Women's March movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, both of which as organizations or movements, I support what they're after 100%. But it felt like when those comments came out, there were ultimately repercussions, but they weren't met with the uproar and the volume that I feel like comments that are directed towards a racist comment, something like that, where it feels like, how do we as Jews have a more powerful social media voice? We don't seem to have culturally prominent people speaking, Jewish or non-Jewish, speaking on our behalf in a way that I feel like when there are other discriminatory statements made by people with a very loud bullhorn, it seems to have a larger impact on refuting it. And it feels like, to me, the lingering anti-Semitism and some of these things that are said that aren't just completely put out start to incorporate themselves into an ideology. And that's what I'm seeing on the left. And part of that ideology, I don't think fairly represents the American Jewish population and who we are and what we believe in and what our contributions are to this country.
But I think that as Jews, one way to combat this is by taking a hard look at what is going on and what is our history. Where have we been? Where have there been positive relationships and where have we missed the mark? Where haven't we listened? Not that any of this is bringing it on ourselves. I think for me, what we have learned over this past year is we need to open our eyes and open our ears and open our hearts and listen to where the critique is. That last week when we had a conversation at our synagogue about the relationship between Jews of color, the Black community, and the Jewish community. And one of our members spoke about how do Jews of color feel when they approach a synagogue and there are police out front. They understand intellectually why police are out front because of the true fear that many in Jewish institutions feel. And so we have security. And yet, because of the other complex issues that go into relationships between some people of color and some members of the NYPD, we've created a challenge. That's not to say that we're wrong for having the police or they're wrong for having their feelings, but we need to be able to understand what's going on. We need to know that we can blend. That doesn't mean that we haven't been hurt. But I can walk down the street, all of us can walk down the street and be safer than some of the people, if you want to say on the left, who have darker skin than all of us. That doesn't make our pain go away. But we also need to listen. And I think that if we don't listen, then we are going to have more problems.
I agree 100% with that.
I also completely agree that, and I see this with ourselves. We look at the police. We have a relationship with the local precinct that we've had for years. I don't want to go into detail about our security apparatus, but we have significant security. And we look at the security guards, including the police and retired police, as friends, as colleagues, as people who help us discharge our own obligations. And every Shabbat after services, I always thank whoever's on guard there. And I really mean it. I mean, I not only am grateful, in some respect, I admire it because it's hard work and it's often thankless work. At the same time, it's undeniable, and we need to really internalize this and listen to African American colleagues in terms of what their relationship with the police is, which is substantially different, and is born of a substantially different historical experience than our own. And Rabbi Ain and I, Rachel and I, participate in various other interfaith forums where we do have an opportunity to hear the pain and the historical, the living historical presence of the past discrimination that creates this kind of relationship with the police that is completely different from the Jewish community.
Right. So I agree with that also, and I have other thoughts on that, but I wanted to actually come back to Michael's, sort of original question in this, about prominent voices for against anti-Semitism, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, and the role, that they're playing, whether it was Black Lives Matter or the Women's March, that there wasn't this, strong outrage against it. So first of all, I think starting about a year ago, after first Poway and then Jersey City and Muncie, I think you started to see a bit of that coming out. I remember Kareem Abdul-Jabbar actually had a famous, tweet about it. And I think people were starting to speak about it. And then we hit this pandemic. I think we were just maybe coming to that moment where people were actually awakening to this Jewish experience. And then it just got interrupted by a pandemic. Whether, what it would continue and how it would have looked would have been different. But I think you did start to see that. And I think I mentioned this in one of our previous episodes, that this pandemic kind of skews our sense of time, but it was literally only a little over a year ago at this point.
Well, think about the march that so many of us went on over the bridge into Brooklyn.
13 months ago, it was not, and had a lot, by the way, lots of non-Jewish, participation in that 25,000 people strong marching across the Brooklyn Bridge.
Right.
And that was 13 months ago. It's pretty recent. I think there's a second piece to this, is that, and if you're going to mention specifically, groups on the left, is that for many, and this is because of the public perception of Jews, have a hard time looking at Jews as a vulnerable or oppressed group. They see, Jews are overall doing very well in this country. We're overrepresented in government. We're overrepresented in corporate CEOs. As a specific ethnic group, we are economically far well off, and the stuff that we love to brag about, Nobel Peace Prize winners and accomplishments in Hollywood. It's hard to see Jews as vulnerable and oppressed, and particularly people on the left. It's just so hard to emotionally internalize it. We've not really been able to come up with a language to sort of speak about it. And, we Jews, because we have a deeper sense of that history, of our vulnerability, because we can carry 2,000 years worth of memory. And it's, whether it's the Holocaust or even things older, is not that far back for us. But for the rest of the world, it might as well be. And, Stephen mentioned things like privilege. The world will see us as privileged, and in many ways we are, but Jews have a harder time seeing ourselves as privileged than they see us. And I recently, came across actually in this whole debate about the California Ethnic Studies, curriculum, which was still problematic in many ways, but I saw an interesting phrase, introduced there, which maybe is a phrase that we need to use. It said that Jews have conditional privilege. Meaning that we've been granted privilege in this society, but it's conditional in the sense that at any point, and we know this from history, it could be revoked. And that we're aware that it could be gone in any moment. Look at, the Jews in Germany in 1920s, 1930s were also quite privileged and doing quite well. And on the turn of a dime, it disappeared. And we live knowing, and that's actually not just Germany, like, that's been the pattern through Jewish history, is that we do well and then it's taken away. And then we're invited someplace else and we're actually invited in, and we're invited to do well, and then it's taken away. And we have that lived internalized experience that anything that we have that's good and privileged can be taken away in a moment's notice. And communicating that is saying, yes, you might look at us, you might think that we're privileged and we're doing quite well, but we live with the pain and the history knowing that that could be gone tomorrow.
Well, I think that is what was so painful and eye-opening about Charlottesville in 2017. The the money line, Jews will not replace us. Of all the things that needed to be picked up, that it was about that, and it reminded us we're not as safe as we think. And then fast forward to January 6th, 6 MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, and Camp Auschwitz, and you're like, we've been concerned about language on the left, as we can talk about. Though I have to come back to the dialogue over the past 4 years. It appears with the leaders of the Movement for Black Lives, which has resulted in the removal of language of genocide about Israel, is really significant, and that we need to mention that we often criticize left-wing movements for being anti-Israel, but when you engage in dialogue, sometimes you can actually make change. That's a side piece, but I think it's crucial to this conversation. But when you look at Charlottesville and you look at January 6th, and you realize people are looking at us and they hate us, and we represent the big lie, and that is terrifying. And for me, the most terrifying moment was that there were people with Israeli flags on January 6th. Not that Jews can't be Republican. Of course, Jews can be Republican. There's plenty of ideals, part of the Republican Party, that people can understand and celebrate. But how somebody with an Israeli flag can stand next to 6 MWE, that is a bridge too far for me.
I would say, maybe just to bring this rabbinically to what my colleagues have said, for me, one of the great verses in the Bible when it comes to the Jews in society, that I like to say, if you're going to remember one verse in the Bible, remember this. And then, I talk about 1,000 verses, but if you're going to remember one verse in the Bible, remember this, that at the beginning of the book of Exodus, after all that Joseph had done to save the Egyptians from famine and, made them a superpower of the world, they had all the food and nobody else had any food. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, there's a verse that says, and there arose a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, didn't remember what Joseph had done, Joseph representing the Israelites, the Hebrews, and the Jews. And that is a pattern that has been repeated over and over and over again in history. In fact, that's the norm. The exception so far is the United States, but the norm is, at some point there arises a leadership that knows perhaps what the Jews have done for the country, nonetheless doesn't recognize it, or there comes a point in time where they don't even know, they don't even care, or they don't remember.
I think that's actually a good segue. I had an interesting thought listening to Rabbi Yain just now, is that, the part of this conversation is also the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Particularly with Jews on both sides of the political spectrum, anti-Semitism can arise on both sides of the political spectrum. And that therefore, as soon as we see it on the other side of the political spectrum, we want to use it to attack them, saying, look at the, this leftist anti-Israel stuff, they're anti-Semitic and therefore delegitimate. And that's why people are going to get defensive, and likewise on the right. And defining something as anti-Semitism and identifying it doesn't necessarily need to be a referendum on people's character. It actually sometimes could be just an invitation to dialogue and conversation. And that can actually make and education is important. And Rabbi Yain pointed out rightfully, just the dialogue with Black Lives Matter, making that change was really helpful. And I think there are many other places where it could be helpful. And it's not just, by the way, on the left. A colleague and friend of mine who's a rabbi in Chicago hosted an event in his synagogue where they had 3 former neo-Nazis come and speak in the synagogue. And they spoke about their transformation and leaving that world. One of them was a previous Grand Wizard of the KKK and totally transformed, his life and recognized. And he said, part of it was coming into a synagogue and for the first time in his life and meeting Jews. And he said, because he sort of realized, he says, how can you hate somebody you don't even know? It's actually, then realize actually it's probably the reason is you hate the people you don't actually know. And that, this outreach and just getting people to know who is a Jew, what we are, who we represent, and building relationships across the spectrum, it's actually those relationships will help. And in fact, it's those relationships, if they're actually built before there's a problem, actually will help a lot more when problems actually arise, as opposed to just reaching out to someone once there's a problem.
Absolutely. And actually, that really does take us full circle to where we started in that, listening to each other and connecting ourselves through humanity, especially the grassroots level in synagogues, but also with social media to find a way to be able to have a dialogue, to get to know each other, regardless of your political affiliation or what country you're from, and how can we as Jews have a stronger presence in initiating that type of dialogue with all types of groups. And so, it feels like something, a little bit of a vacuum out there that would be great for us to slowly try to fill, just to represent who we are. And you three as a perfect example with 3 different denominations, but all Jewish, and be able to talk about our history and educate people on that anxiety and insecurity. I think genetically we all feel from thousands of years of, there being a new pharaoh who doesn't remember us and what could happen next. So I have one more question. I know we're almost out of time, and this is a less charged question, but I found technology incredibly helpful over the pandemic because it connected us to Rabbi Hirsch, to services, to our community. I'm curious about social media and the amount of time it takes from people's lives and their habits and their other commitments. And if you notice within your congregation, or just in general, any either decrease or increase based on the amount of time people are now giving to their phones, or their computers, that used to be time spent in other ways.
I don't know if I can judge that, because I was never, like, even in a pre-pandemic world when we were in person, people still had their lives outside of what they were doing with the synagogue. So I imagine they were on their phones, on their computers, on social media. What I have found incredible, and it's why I use social media as a tool. I primarily live on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, don't really use it. I'm on Instagram, but I feel old. My kids are telling me I need to learn how to use it. So for me, for sure, Facebook is the main place I live, but I have a lot more contact with people because of social media. It is another gathering space, whether it's the happy birthdays, whether it's the fact that we broadcast our Shabbat services also on Facebook. So I have people on Zoom, but I also have people commenting Shabbat Shalom and being a part of the Facebook dialogue, or other things that we post with regard to programming. I feel that's a central square where I see people, and that's important today. So I embrace it.
Social media is a fact of life. Technology is a fact of life. It's going to get more powerful. It's going to get better. It will allow us to do more things that in theory, in principle, can, like every other enterprise, can advance our enterprise and the values that we represent. And so that in and of itself would be a good thing if we are able to take advantage of the new technology that would allow us to do that. At the end of the day, the most important thing, and I say this as a rabbi, that we represent morals, we represent values at the end of the day. We represent a constant reminder to people, yes, use technology, but don't be a slave to technology. Use the screen, but don't have the screen rule you. You rule the screen. And when you think about social media now, if a Martian were to descend, not knowing anything about humankind, and they were to see some just New Yorkers walking the street, would they conclude that we control the screen or the screen controls us, you know? And at the end of the day, with everything that I completely agree with what Rachel said, the end of the day, we need to insist Facebook friends cannot replace real friends, and that virtual technology cannot replace real relationships. And we also have to remember that technology is neutral. It's not in and of itself bad, and it's not in and of itself good. It has the potential for a lot of good, but as we see, as we've spent the last hour speaking, it has the potential for enormous evil. And what will be the outcome at the end? What will determine in the end is our fundamental values. Do we believe in good things? If we believe in good things, the technology can be a huge asset to us. But the other side can also use technology, and they can drop bombs on buildings, and they can use technology to foment revolution and conspiracies. So that's the thing to remember about science in general and technology in general. It's neutral. It's only good if we ourselves are good and we use the technology in order to advance goodness.
Rabbi Herman, do you have any thoughts on that?
Actually, I think Rabbi Hirsch, that was a really excellent paradigm, and actually just really love him, just even using and teaching this notion, are we, in control of the technology in control of us? And I think actually that's part of the fundamental lesson of Shabbat, is that, we take a break from the technological world to basically say that it doesn't rule us, that we can actually stop, at a moment's notice. And I'm just thinking, actually, I can't comment about the lives of my congregants, but I'm going to comment sort of my own life. And I think in many ways, it's actually the genesis of this project. I'm someone who used to be on Facebook a lot, certainly pre-pandemic. And I actually sort of found as the pandemic started, I was on obviously even more because that was a way to connect. But I found myself sometimes just getting sucked into it and realizing that certain conversations, because of who I was engaged in, just weren't getting anywhere. And I found that there was ways to be much more impactful by leaving social media. Just, two examples, the last couple of weeks has been a lot of debate about we started anti-Semitism, but the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which was just now reiterated by the Biden State Department, and it's caused a renewed debate. It's been debated over time, and I found myself, like others, getting into a whole Facebook debate, posting back and forth, and I'm like, so a bunch of 100 people are maybe going to read this, and I had thoughts on it. And I said, what's the value? I said, why am I spending hours and hours on Facebook about this definition? Whereas I called a friend who I knew was well-connected, involved in anti-Semitism, who then connected me to someone in the Simon Wiesenthal Center who actually had to work on it. And just before we got on this call, I actually had a very productive conversation about the definition, its genesis. I understand a lot more about it. And actually getting off Facebook and getting on the phone, I felt was a much more deeply impactful way to deal with that issue. And what actually started this dialogue across the streams is I felt as I'm someone who, despite being in a denomination that identifies not moderate, I see myself as a moderate person. And I felt particularly in social media today, the moderate voice has a really hard time breaking through because we're so polarized and extreme. And I reached out to Rabbi Hirsch and Rabbi Ain, two other people in different denominations, but I know are both moderates, and said, let's use a different format. And maybe, with this, and I think it's been great so far, at least, even if for nobody, the rest of the world, I don't know, but for me, it's been great. And it feels like I'm able, and the three of us together are able to have a moderate voice possibly be heard a lot more. And there are ways to break through that are not, Facebook and Twitter and, Reddit broke through the Super Bowl. So there's a new, something for us to learn. But I think even just, picking up the phone, talking to people in person, I'm hoping this will all be in person, soon one day, but it's a valuable tool, but it doesn't replace things that actually can really have a really strong impact.
Well, thank you, the three of you, Rabbi, and Rabbi, for talking today and the dialogue, and that's it. We're done.
Thank you.
Thank you.